The lectures for Module 12 will focus on the Civil Rights Movement from 1960 to 1965. In Part 1 of this lecture series, we'll take a look at the sit-ins and the freedom rides. Then we'll take a look at community efforts at community-wide desegregation, focusing on two movements or two areas in which the civil rights activists attempted to bring about the complete desegregation of their communities, and not just simply sit-ins at lunch counters or freedom rides in buses or desegregation of schools, but the community as a whole, looking at all elements of the community, including voter registration. In the 1960s, grassroots movements to desegregate communities in the South spread across the southern states. In May of 1956, some of these had even begun as early, even before the beginning of the 60s, and as early as the mid-1950s. In May of 1956, students from Florida A&M University launched a bus boycott. In June of 1956, Black activists in Alabama reacted to the statewide ban on the NAACP with the formation of the Alabama Christian Movement for Human Rights. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference was organized in January of 1957 in the aftermath of the Montgomery bus boycott. Martin Luther King was selected to head the organization and helped draft a statement to the South and the nation, in which he linked the Southern Black struggle to global politics. In March of 1957, King attended the independence ceremony for the African nation of Ghana. Also present were A. Philip Randolph, Adam Clayton Powell, Jr., and Ralph Bunche. Also present in terms of Black activists or Black leaders of this period, African American leaders of this period. The position of the SCLC in the freedom struggle was not clear. Initially, they launched a voter registration drive, but they only managed to register a few thousand voters, even after the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1957. And if you'll remember from the lectures in the previous module, we ended on the note, on that particular note of looking at how the National Congress, the legislature, was moving to enter efforts at desegregation with two Civil Rights Acts, 1957 and 1960, both of which focused on voter registration. In 1957, you had the desegregation of Little Rock Central High School, led by the NAACP's Daisy Bates and the Little Rock Nine. And in the late 1950s and the beginning and early 1960s, we began to see the efforts of another woman who would be very active in helping with the organization of college students. This woman was, of course, Ella Baker, who headed SCLC's Atlanta headquarters in the late 1950s. Now, Ella Baker was a long-time activist, civil rights activist. She was involved in civil rights struggles dating back to the 1930s, when she organized consumer cooperatives in New York City. In the 1940s, she joined the NAACP's national staff as director of branches, but resigned in 1946 because she was convinced that Walter White's leadership stifled the organization. In the 1950s, she led the New York City branch of the NAACP in the struggle to end segregation in schools. In northern states, segregation in schools and in communities was often accomplished through what we'll call de facto segregation. In other words, not segregation that is the result of some kind of legal actions, laws that are put in place by a community, but segregation that, in a sense, just happens after the fact. If a community is segregated, for example, the schools will, if they're neighborhood schools, also be segregated. By 1959, Black college students were planning a new strategy to promote desegregation of lunch counters in urban department stores. Nashville students attended nonviolent workshops led by James Lawson, who was a student at Vanderbilt University Divinity School. and Nashville students were holding test sit-ins as early as November of 1959. But on February 4th of 1960, before the Nashville sit-ins got underway, 4 students from North Carolina A&T University in Greensboro, North Carolina, sat in at a segregated lunch counter at a Woolworth's department store. The students were aware of the Montgomery bus boycott and had read Core's pamphlet on resistance tactics. The students, of course, had also been aware of the murder of Emmett Till, and in the last module, you did a discussion and looked at some videos and everything, where you discussed the impact of the Till murder on young people as a motivating factor in leading them to become a part of the civil rights struggles. Sit-ins spread beyond Greensboro, and in 1 week, there were 54 sit-ins in 15 cities, including Nashville. Now, if we back up to what's happening in Greensboro, on the first day, there were 4 students, the 4 students that you see in the photograph on this slide. The very next day, there were 24 students who were involved in the sit-ins efforts. White women from a local women's college joined the demonstrators on the 4th day. By September of 1960, as these demonstrations spread across the South, as these protests spread across the South, 70,000 people had demonstrated throughout in their communities. Protests took place at lunch counters, parks, swimming pools, beaches, restaurants, transportation facilities, museums, art galleries. The overall impact of these sit-ins was widespread. One thing that was very clear to the student demonstrators was that sometimes they didn't get a lot of support from the Black community. There was a generational divide in some cases. The NAACP was still considered the most dominant, or the dominant organization, civil rights organization, in many northern and southern communities. And for these young demonstrators to come into the communities, or to come from the communities, from the colleges sometimes and universities, Black colleges and universities in the communities, and then to take a stand that in some cases went counter to what the NAACP stood for, was a thing that many in the Black community could not understand. The NAACP's approach to civil rights activism was essentially to work through the courts. And in the previous modules, you've seen how this is operated. You see court case after court case building legal precedents that would challenge segregation. But these demonstrators are doing something different. They are taking direct action. They had their greatest impact in the upper South rather than in the lower South. By late 1960 and early 1961, student leaders were beginning to call for some kind of organization of the activists, student activists. Ella Baker, who was at that time again executive director of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, called together the young leaders to a meeting at Shaw College in Raleigh, North Carolina. She encouraged the students to organize themselves and to maintain control of their organization, to push for direct action, to push for what she described as participatory democracy, a strategy that would allow communities to decide what would be the goals of their movements. This became the pattern of protest for these young demonstrators, these young activists, for the next few years. However, at this point, the sit-ins were not arousing the conscience of the nation. They were just simply student activists, students responding, or students demonstrating. And one important thing that we should also note is that even though we have photographs of the sit-ins in some of these communities and the demonstrations in some communities, these sit-ins were not televised to the extent that the civil rights movement would. They did not utilize the media to the extent that the civil rights movement would utilize the media throughout the rest of the 1960s. They were essentially ignored by presidential candidates. They had a sound political strategy, or it had been a sound political strategy since the end of Reconstruction, that both party regulars and party centrists, devoted very little attention to civil rights. They, in a sense, gave lip service to the problems of African Americans. To a great extent, young activists were pushing the envelope on this issue of the involvement of presidential candidates or presidents themselves, or even governors and other leaders on the issue of desegregation. In 1961, we also saw another type of protests beginning to come to the forefront. And this protest was actually launched not by a new movement in the sense of the organization that the students had founded, and I didn't mention a few minutes ago, but that organization that was put together by the student activists of Raleigh, North Carolina, became known as the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Even though Ella Baker was active with SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and had been sent to Raleigh by the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, she encouraged the young activists to maintain an independence from other organizations and to form their own leadership. So, as we'll see from this point on, we'll begin to see some of the most prominent activists from the student movement coming to the forefront, like James Lawson or Diane Nash. These will be the leaders of the student movement. Now, back to this particular slide. In the 1940s, the Congress of Racial Equality had been established by James Farmer with the help of a man by the name of Bayard Rustin. Farmer and Rustin were very much involved in launching what was called the Journey of Reconciliation, an early freedom ride in 1947. The Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE's, central strategy in this journey of reconciliation was to board interstate buses and try to desegregate bus terminals in the South. The group was also testing compliance with the in the 1960s, this was their strategy. They were testing compliance with the Supreme Court ruling banning segregation in interstate transportation that the earlier activists from CORE had brought to the Supreme Court and moved up to the Supreme Court in the Morgan case. In May of 1961, 7 blacks and 6 whites left Washington, D.C. in 2 buses, traveled through Alabama and Mississippi, to New Orleans, Louisiana. In Anniston, Alabama, a mob slit the bus's tires, smashed windows, tossed firebombs, and attacked fleeing riders of one bus. In Birmingham, Alabama, Freedom Riders were beaten by 30 Klansmen carrying bats, pipes, and bicycle chains. One person was left brain damaged as a result of these beatings. Sheriff Eugene Bull Connor had the demonstrators arrested and jailed and then taken to the Alabama state line, but the group returned to Birmingham and continued on to Montgomery. Freedom Riders received no protection from the federal government. The FBI knew police would let the mob attack, but J. Edgar Hoover, who was the director of the FBI, never told Attorney General Robert Kennedy that this was going to take place. SNCC volunteers, directed by Diane Nash, carried the Freedom Rides into Alabama and Mississippi. They were attacked in Montgomery, as I said before, and some demonstrators spent as much as 39 days in maximum security at Parchman Prison Farm in Mississippi. The Freedom Rides continued throughout the summer of 1961. 2/3 of the demonstrators were college students, 3/4 of them were men, and more than 1/2 of the demonstrators were black. The Interstate Commerce Commission, or the ICC, at the request of Robert Kennedy, finally prohibited interstate bus and railroad companies from using segregated facilities. Now, by the segregated facilities, I mean specifically the waiting rooms and in the bus and segregated bus terminals in cities like Memphis or Birmingham or Montgomery. In the summer of 1961, however, student activists in SNCC began to divide over whether to continue these community-wide desegregation efforts, as well as the freedom rides and the sit-ins, or to shift to voter registration. Remember, this is after that Second Civil Rights Act, which had focused on voter registration. Ella Baker worked out a compromise that essentially divided SNCC into two wings. Voter registration project would be headed by Bob Moses, and the desegregation efforts would be headed by Diane Nash. Diane Nash was a veteran of the civil rights, or the sit-ins rather, in Nashville, Tennessee. In October of 1961, or from October of 1961 to August of 1962, the community of Albany, Georgia, civil rights organizations, in particular SNCC organizers, challenged segregation, community-wide segregation, and continued the efforts that had been characteristics of the movement in the 1960s. The goal of what became known as the Albany Movement was to desegregate all facilities in the city of Albany, Georgia. SNCC workers Charles Sherrod, Cordell Reagan, and Charles Jones came into Albany to conduct a voter registration drive. But again, they did not stop at this. Even though there was this division that had occurred within SNCC over the question of which of the two things should they work on. Should it just be the voter registration, or should it be desegregating facilities? With the Albany movement, we see that they're spreading themselves across the whole community, trying to do all of these things. And some would say that that was one of the problems with the Albany movement. Albany blacks essentially coordinated their efforts in the formation of this Albany movement. The people of Albany selected Dr. William G. Anderson as their president, the president of the Albany movement. The movement held mass meetings and demonstrations, and by mid-December, over 500 people had been jailed. At that point, they decided to call in the Reverend Martin Luther King to keep the momentum going and to bring some national attention to their movement. Police Chief Laurie Pritchard of Albany, Georgia, managed to a great extent, suppress this movement. He confronted it in such a way that it caught the civil rights activists off guard. One of the first things he did was to curb white extremists, so there was very little bad press concerning the events in Albany. He kept the whites in Albany under control. Then, as he arrested demonstrators, he spread them out over neighboring communities so that there was never what we could call a critical mass in the jails in Albany that might force the community to negotiate and to end segregation. There was also a lack of federal support for the Albany demonstrators. Robert Kennedy, Attorney General Robert Kennedy, and President John Kennedy were cautious because of the upcoming elections in 1962, the congressional elections in 62, and the 1964 presidential election. Senator James Eastland of Mississippi was head of the Judiciary Committee, and he engineered the appointment of 4 segregationist judges in the Deep South. This, of course, meant that when these demonstrators came up before the judges or the courts, came up in the courts, or when even challenges to segregation came to the courts in the Deep South, that the judges would probably rule in favor of segregation. King and SCLC left Albany after what they considered an unsuccessful desegregation campaign. Some SCLC leaders felt that the Albany movement had lacked focus and direction, and they vowed that in future movements they would not make that same mistake. Now, in kind of line of what we're going to be doing all the way through this, we have to step back and say, well, okay, if the Albany movement was a failure, what was its impact? Did it have any positive things that you could look at? Was there any lasting lessons that came out of this movement? One of the things that is kind of a lasting lesson that we'll see continued as a hallmark of the movement, civil rights movement, for the next few years or throughout the movement, was to this movement made Martin Luther King aware of the power of music in the movement. The SNCC Freedom Singers, led by Bernice Johnson Reagan, who was an Albany native, captured the emotion and the passion of the movement. Some of you may be familiar with the SNCC Freedom Singers in a different form. They were very prominent during the Civil Rights Movement. But then after the Civil Rights Movement ended, their particular kind of a cappella singing and their involvement with other movements, protest movements, and adopting or expressing the feelings of the people of protest movements, led them to continue as a singing group that became known as Sweet Honey and the Rock. They performed a couple of times in Memphis and in other southern cities, as well as throughout the North. Martin Luther King also, even though King felt that this Albany movement had been a failure for the civil rights structure, it did have an impact in the community itself. 2 months after King left Albany, black voter registration led to a runoff election between a black candidate and a white candidate for a seat on the city commission. And the following spring, the city commission in Albany removed all of the segregation statutes from their books. So in effect, citywide or community-wide desegregation was accomplished, but maybe not within or at the time of the movement itself. Some of the other developments during this time period, one of the other developments during this time period was the desegregation of the University of Mississippi. This was only one of several school desegregations that was occurring during this time. You might just maybe take a look and see exactly when and how was the University of Memphis desegregated in the late 1950s. What was the process that was taking place in terms of the group that became known as the Memphis State Eight? At Ole Miss, or the University of Mississippi, President Kennedy and Attorney General Kennedy negotiated with Senator James Eastland and Mississippi Governor Ross Barnett to allow James Meredith, a black student, to enter or to enroll at the University of Mississippi. Eastland and Barnett guaranteed that order would be preserved on the campus, so the Kennedy administration only sent 500 federal marshals to the University of Mississippi to oversee or to maintain control during this desegregation. However, this peaceful, orderly desegregation of the university was not what occurred. By 7:30 on the night that Meredith was enrolled at Ole Miss, a mob of 3,000 whites were throwing bricks and Molotov cocktails on the campus. Mississippi State Police broke their promise of assistance and withdrew from the campus, leaving the 500 federal marshals exposed. In the end, 5,000 Army troops were sent from Memphis to Ole Miss, the Ole Miss campus, but they didn't arrive until 2 a.m. the next morning. And in the violence that took place on the campus during that time, 2 bystanders were killed and 160 people were wounded. Meredith enrolled and was protected by federal guards, but the question remained: what would be the place of the federal government in protecting the rights of black people during these desegregation efforts? In 1962, Congress passed the 24th Amendment, and ratified it by 1964. This amendment banned poll taxes. It promoted the right to vote in primary elections, in presidential and congressional elections, and said that this could not be denied or abridged by the United States or by state governments because of the failure to pay poll taxes or other taxes. Now, you remember that poll taxes had been instituted in the late 1890s as a way of preventing African Americans or poor people in general from voting. You had to pay your tax, your poll tax, before you could register to vote. However, in the late 1800s, the way in which many white citizens got around the poll tax was through something called the grandfather clause. But looking back at your previous lectures, you remember that the Supreme Court had in 1915 ruled that the grandfather clause or grandfather clauses in different states were unconstitutional. In 1963, civil rights activists attempted community-wide desegregation again in Birmingham, Alabama. Birmingham had a reputation of being the most segregated city in America. On April the 3rd, civil rights demonstrators launched sit-ins, marches, and they were arrested, but there was no violence. On April the 8th, Sheriff Bull Connor, or Police Commissioner Bull Connor, began to move in to break up the demonstrations through the use of dogs, like you see in the photograph that you have here. And on April the 17th, Martin Luther King was jailed in these demonstrations. He remained in jail over the Easter weekend. Now, we will stop at this point and pick up with what's happening in Birmingham in the next lecture. And in the next lecture, we'll focus primarily, or I'd like to focus in the beginning, not primarily, but in the beginning, on King's philosophy of nonviolent direct action. And we'll see this clearly expressed in the letter from the Birmingham jail, which he writes during this period of demonstrations.